On a freezing winter day, a kind waitress gave two hungry orphans a bowl of soup and lost her job for it. 20 years later, Nora Bennett's quiet life is interrupted when a sleek black Jaguar pulls up and two strangers step out. They're Caleb and Isla, the children she once saved, now grown and successful. What they reveal will clear her name, expose the lies that ruined her, and prove that one small act of kindness can change everything. Nora hadn't had a visitor in 10 years when that Christmas Eve rolled around in 2023. Not since the town called her a thief, not since the church called her worse. The whispers followed her like shadows in those days. I watched from this very window as neighbors crossed the street rather than walk past her little house on Maple Street. But on that particular Christmas Eve night, when that black Jaguar purred up her broken driveway like a cat stalking prey, some debts don't stay buried forever. The two figures stepping out of that gleaming car carried the kind of reckoning that only comes when the hungry get fed and the liars get found. The headlights cut through the December darkness, illuminating her old soup kitchen sign, hanging crooked on its rusty chain. Soul Stew, it had read once, back when the letters weren't faded and the hope wasn't gone. The paint was peeling now, 20 years of weather having taken its toll. But somehow those words still held power, still meant something to folks who remembered. A man stepped out first, his movements careful and deliberate. Even from my window 3 houses down, I could see he was tall and well-dressed, the kind of man who'd learned to carry himself with purpose. His gloved hand clutched something small and stained. My old eyes weren't what they used to be, but I could tell it was a napkin, old and yellowed with age. A napkin from 2003, as it would turn out. But why they'd waited 20 years to come back, and why Marissa Vale's name was scribbled on that napkin in what looked suspiciously like dried blood, well, that's where our story truly begins. The woman who emerged from the passenger side moved with the grace of someone who'd fought battles and won them. Someone who'd learned that victory sometimes tastes like soup and sometimes like justice. Her hair caught the streetlight, and for a moment, I thought I was seeing a ghost. But ghosts don't drive Jaguars, and ghosts don't carry briefcases full of legal documents that would topple an empire built on the suffering of children. You see, December 17, 2003, was the day Nora Bennett lost her job and found her soul. I remember it clear as yesterday, because that was the morning my Ruth made her last batch of Christmas cookies before the cancer took her voice away. The snow was falling thick that morning, the kind that makes the whole world look clean, even when it's rotten underneath. From my kitchen window, I watched the flakes dance in the amber glow of the streetlights, each one perfect and unique, just like the souls we meet in this life. Nora had been working the morning shift at Mickey's Diner over on Commerce Street, pouring coffee for truckers and serving up eggs that had seen better days. It was honest work for honest pay, and Nora had never asked for more than that. She was the kind of woman who said please and thank you to everyone, who remembered how customers liked their coffee, who slipped extra bacon to the construction workers, who reminded her of her daddy. Mickey's wasn't much to look at. Truth be told, the linoleum was cracked, the booths were held together with duct tape and prayer, and a coffee machine made sounds like a dying cat when it was brewing. But it was warm, and it smelled like home cooking. And for folks who didn't have much of either, it was a sanctuary. Nora understood that. She'd made it her mission to make sure everyone who walked through those doors felt like they belonged somewhere, even if it was just for the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. But then they walked in, and everything changed. Caleb and Isla, 7 and 9 years old, respectively, though their eyes looked decades older. They weren't beggars, mind you. Ghosts is what they were, with ribs like prison bars showing through their thin jackets and fingers so pale they looked translucent. Their shoes had holes that let the snow seep through, and Isla kept stomping her feet to keep the feeling in her toes, making little squeaking sounds on the worn linoleum dot. They stood by the door like they weren't sure they were allowed to come. In their eyes taking in the warmth and the smell of food with the kind of hunger that goes deeper than the stomach. Caleb had his arm around his sister's shoulders, protective in the way that children learn to be when adults fail them. Isla clutched a paper bag that looked like it held everything she owned in this world. When Nora saw them huddled by the door, something stirred in her chest, something she hadn't felt since she was their age, standing in the kitchen of Sister Margaret's orphanage, watching the other children fight over scraps. She remembered the taste of watered-down gruel and the ache of going to bed with an empty stomach. She remembered Sister Margaret's ruler across her knuckles when she was caught stealing bread for the smaller children. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. Sister Margaret had been a woman who believed suffering built character, that hunger taught gratitude, and that children were born sinful and needed to be purged of their wickedness to deprivation. Stealing bread gets you the closet, the old nun would say, her voice sharp as winter wind, her eyes cold as January frost. But sharing it gets you the strap. Nora could still feel the welts that strap had left. She could still remember the taste of her own blood when she bit her tongue to keep from crying out. But what Sister Margaret never understood was that every blow of that strap only strengthened Nora's resolve to be different, to be better, to be the kind of person who saw hunger and filled it instead of using it as a weapon. Looking at these two children, Nora saw herself 30 years back, all hollow cheeks and desperate hope. Without a word, she moved to the soup pot and ladled out the biggest bowl the diner had. Thick with vegetables and chunks of beef that cost more than her hourly wage. The soup was her own recipe, something she'd been perfecting for months, adding herbs and spices she bought with her own money to make it taste like love felt warm. She slid the bowl across the counter along with a basket of crackers and 2 glasses of milk that she'd pay for herself if she had to. The milk was fresh and cold, the kind of white that promised nutrition and comfort. She added a pat of butter to the crackers, knowing that sometimes it's the small luxuries that remind us we're human. Isla's eyes went wide as saucers when she saw that feast spread before them. She grabbed a handful of crackers and stuffed them in her sock with the quick, furtive movements of someone who'd learned that food was never guaranteed. For later, she whispered, as if speaking too loud might make the bounty disappear like a mirage in the desert. Caleb said nothing, just stared at that bowl like it was the Holy Grail itself. His hands shook as he picked up the spoon, and I imagined Nora could see the prayer of gratitude in his eyes, the kind of thanksgiving that comes from the very depths of the soul. When he took that first sip, his whole body relaxed for maybe the first time in months. Walter Price, the dishwasher, who'd been working at Mickey's since before televisions were color, shuffled over and watched the children eat. He was a man of few words, carved from granite and weathered by time, but when he did speak, folks listened. His hands were scarred from years of washing dishes in scalding water, and his back was bent from decades of standing over industrial sinks, but his eyes were sharp and kind. "Kid," he said to Nora, his voice rough as sandpaper dragged across concrete, "you just fed 2 wolves. The problem is one's named Marissa." Now Marissa Vale was the kind of woman who wore her cruelty like jewelry, all shiny and displayed for the world to see. She managed the day shift at Nicky's with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. And she had eyes like a hawk and twice the mean streak. She'd been watching Nora and those children from across the diner, her red lipstick pursed in disapproval that could freeze coffee in the cup. Marissa believed in rules the way some people believe. In religion, with zealous fervor and no room for interpretation. There was a rule about not serving people who couldn't pay, a rule about portion control, a rule about everything that might interfere with the profit margin. She kept those rules written down in a little notebook she carried, adding new ones whenever she caught someone showing too much humanity. Her office was in the back of the diner, a cramped space that smelled of cigarettes and cheap perfume. The walls were covered with employee schedules, health department certificates, and photographs of Marissa with various local dignitaries. She kept a calculator on her desk at all times, constantly running numbers, always looking for ways to squeeze more profit from less investment. But Nora had learned something important in those orphanage years, something that Marissa would never understand. Kindness ain't free. It's a debt the world collects with interest, and the interest rate varies depending on how much love you put into the principle. And sure enough, as those children finished their soup and warmed their hands on the empty bowl, Marissa's scream cut through the diner like a knife through silk. "Where's the cash?" The tip jar was gone. $2,347 that Nora had been saving for. Her mother's Christmas present had vanished like smoke in the wind. It wasn't much money, not to most folks, but to Nora, It represented hours of refilled coffee cups and patient smiles, small kindnesses that added up to something meaningful. Marissa's painted nails left moon-shaped cuts on Nora's arm as she grabbed her, her French manicure drawing blood from skin that had already been weathered by years of honest work. "I saw you with those little thieves," Marissa hissed. Her breath smelled of coffee in spite of something rotten underneath. "You're all in it together, aren't you? Running some kind of scam on my diner." The accusation hit Nora like a physical blow. In all her years of working, in all her years of serving others, no one had ever questioned her honesty. Her integrity was the one thing she'd managed to keep intact through all the hardships of her life. The one treasure that couldn't be stolen, lost, or broken. The police came within the hour, their boots heavy on the cracked linoleum. Their questions were sharp and suspicious. Officer Marco Alvarez was kind enough, but Officer Derek Holt had the look of a man who'd already made up his mind before he walked through the door. They took statements from Marissa, from Walter Price, and from the 3 customers who'd been in the diner when the jar disappeared. The children were long gone by then, vanished into the December cold, like they'd never existed at all. But the empty bowl remained on the counter, a testament to the meal that had started this whole chain of events. Nora stared at that bowl while the officers questioned her, wondering if she'd somehow brought this on herself by daring to show compassion. The manager came next, Mr. Harold Benton, a thin man who looked like he'd been pressed flat by the weight of corporate expectations. He'd been running Mickey's for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never had an employee accused of theft. His hands shook as he filled out the paperwork, as if the very act of firing someone might contaminate him with their supposed dishonesty. By evening, there was a pink slip in Nora's locker and a notice that read "terminated for theft" in Marissa's careful handwriting. But the real crime wasn't the missing money, though that stung deep enough. The real crime was that napkin, the one Nora had used to wipe Isla's chin when the child had dripped soup on her jacket. Later, much later, Nora would remember the details that didn't make sense at the time. The way Marissa had lingered by the children's table after they'd left. The way she'd picked up that napkin and examined it closely before stuffing it in her apron pocket. The way she'd smiled when she thought no one was looking, a smile that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with satisfaction. That napkin had Marissa's lipstick print on it, sure enough, but it also had something else. Numbers written in what looked like Caleb's shaky child's handwriting. Numbers that, when arranged correctly, formed the combination to the diner's safe. Numbers that no customer should have known. Numbers that Marissa herself had written down and left carelessly on the counter that morning when she'd been rushing to make the bank deposit. The security cameras in Mickey's were old and unreliable. And wouldn't you know it, the footage from 3:07 p.m. that afternoon was mysteriously corrupted. Technical malfunction, the company said when the police asked to review the tapes. Happens all the time with equipment that old. Eddie knew better though. As Nora cleaned out her locker that night, her hands shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak, he shuffled over with his characteristic limp and whispered words that would haunt her for years to come. "Tessa's brother runs the shelter those kids vanished from," he said, his eyes darting toward the kitchen where Marissa was counting the days with unusual thoroughness. "Funny how kids keep disappearing from there, and Tessa keeps getting bonuses for operational efficiency." But pieces of a larger puzzle were scattered around them, but Nora was too hurt and too shocked to put them together just yet. All she could think about was the unfairness of it all. The way 20 years of honest work could be erased by one moment of compassion gone wrong. That night, as Nora made her way home through snow that had shifted from lovely to lethal, she caught one last sight of Caleb and Isla. They were being lifted into a Child Protective Services van, their small shapes swallowed by the official-looking adults around them. Isla wept, her tears turning to ice on her cheeks in the brutal cold. But Caleb didn't cry. He stared straight at Nora through the rear window of that van, his young face fixed with a resolve that seemed far too old for 7. His lips formed 2 words she would never forget. 2 words that would ring in her head for the next 20 years. "We'll be back." The van rolled into the dark, carrying those kids toward whatever hell they'd once run from. And Nora stood in the falling snow, wondering if she had just watched her own ruin or theirs. Morning brought news that made her blood chill and her heart crack again. Soul Stew, the little soup kitchen she'd been saving for and dreaming of, was condemned by the city. The building she'd paid a deposit on, the place she planned to serve anyone who needed a meal, was suddenly structurally unsound. An inspector's report turned up overnight, like mushrooms after rain, bearing the signature of Inspector Ellen Reeves, conveniently married to Marissa's cousin. The condemnation was co-signed by Deputy Mayor Clayton Rhodes, who just happened to be Marissa's new boyfriend and soon-to-be husband, in a wedding the society pages would dub the event of the season. Funny how romance and politics lie so comfortably together. How money and influence swirl like cream in coffee. Nora's deposit, every cent saved across 5 years of double shifts and skipped meals, was lost per the lease's fine print. No refunds for acts of God or municipal action. Facing that condemned building on the morning of December 19, 2003, Nora felt something inside her go still. Not her kindness, not her urge to help, but her belief in the system meant to shield people. Like her, the system that should reward toil and restrain those who prey on the weak. The wrecking ball arrived that same afternoon. As if the city could not wait to wipe away every trace of Nora's hopes, she stood among the onlookers and watched 20 years of planning and prayer collapse into dust and shattered brick. The roar of demolition was thunderous, yet she could still hear her own voice, describing to a bank officer how she would serve free food to anyone who walked in. As the dust settled and trucks hauled away debris, Nora noticed 2 familiar faces in the crowd. They weren't crying like the neighbors who knew her plans. They weren't even sad. They were counting. Their lips moved as each chunk fell, as each wall gave way, and Nora realized they were committing it all to memory. Later, much later, she would understand that Caleb and Isla were storing every detail of that destruction, filing it beside every injustice they'd seen, every cruelty endured. Even at 7 and 9, they were building the case, collecting evidence for a reckoning 20 years off. With no job, no references, no prospects, and no hope in a town that had branded her a thief, Nora's soup kitchen dream shrank into something smaller and more urgent. A shopping cart liberated from a grocery lot. A portable hot plate found at a thrift store. A wobbly card table that still held steady under the weight of hope. Set up under the Morrison Street Bridge where homeless veterans gathered and the city's forgotten found shelter from the weather and the eyes of the respectable. The concrete walls were layered with graffiti telling stories of love and loss, of delayed dreams and broken promises, and yet there was beauty there too. Murals by artists who knew that truth sometimes rises out of the darkest places. The homeless veterans who met there became her protectors. Men and women who'd known too much war and too little peace, who understood what it felt like to be discarded by the same society that once hailed them as heroes. Sergeant Marcus Harley lost his left leg in Desert Storm and his family to the struggle of returning home. Nadine Porter had served 3 tours in Vietnam as an army nurse and came back to a country that spat on her uniform and forgot her service. "You fed my kid, lady," Torres told her one raw January night, eyes gentle beneath the scars that crossed his face. "Diego was one of those kids you slipped extra pancakes to on Sundays. Now we feed you." They formed a ring around her makeshift kitchen. These broken soldiers who knew the real battles are fought not with weapons, but with mercy, carried water, donated cans from their meager supplies, and stood guard while she cooked, making sure no one troubled the woman who chose to feed others, even when she could barely feed herself. In a dented recipe box wrapped in plastic to keep out the rain, Nora stored more than instructions. Every napkin with a thank you. Every scrap where someone had written the name to prove they existed. Every small token from people she'd fed. The box became a vault of dignity. Proof that kindness given finds its way back. There were letters from truckers who remembered her coffee, from college kids who scraped together change for meals during finals, from single mothers who brought their children to Mickey's because it was the only place they could afford to feel normal. Each paper told a story, and each story mattered. At the bottom of the box, sealed in plastic like a relic, was a photograph she'd found blowing in the wind after the wrecking ball finished. Maybe someone dropped it or tossed it, assuming no one would notice. But Nora noticed, and she picked it up. What she saw turned her blood to ice. Marissa handing a thick envelope to Director Paul Whitaker, the CPS head. Both smiled like they'd just closed a lucrative deal. They stood outside the Cedar Ridge Group home, the state facility where Caleb and Isla had supposedly lived before wandering into Mickey's that December morning. The timestamp read 2003, one day after Caleb and Isla vanished back into the system. One day after Nora lost everything. One day after Marissa Vale got precisely what she wanted. For 10 long years, Nora ladled soup from that cot beneath the Morrison Street Bridge. She served construction workers between jobs, students whose aid had run out, runaways who had aged out of foster care with nowhere to land. She fed retired teachers whose pensions had been stolen, disabled vets waiting for benefits that might never come, and immigrant families whose dreams of America had collided with the reality of poverty. Each bowl carried a story, and each story settled in Nora's bones like silt in a riverbed. She began to see that she wasn't only feeding bodies. She was feeding souls, nourishing the piece of humanity the world had chosen to ignore. But late at night, when the bridge was empty except for traffic overhead and the whistle of wind through steel girders, doubt would creep in. Was she saving souls or drowning her own shame in an ocean of hunger that would never be filled? The questions cut deepest when police told them to move along, when officials seized her cot for health violations, when well-meaning neighbors complained about the unsightly gathering of desperate people near their neat, safe streets. Some nights she lay on her cot in the women's shelter and wondered if Marissa Vale had been right, as she was enabling people who should be helping themselves. But morning came, and someone approached with hollow eyes and empty hands, and Nora remembered why she started. Soup, she learned, isn't just food. It's proof. Proof someone saw you when the world looked away. Proof you mattered when everything else said you didn't. Proof that love can be measured by the tablespoon and served hot when everything else has gone cold. The years slid by, each one bringing new faces and familiar needs. Nora's bright hair faded to gray, then white, and the steady motion of ladling and stirring left her hands aching with arthritis. Her back bent from hauling water and folding tables. Her feet went flat from standing on concrete day after day. Yet her smile held. Her ladle stayed full. Her belief in people's goodness somehow survived the world's cruelty. Then, on a Tuesday in March 2013, fire tore it all apart. Nearly 10 years to the day since she lost her job at Mickey's, Nora had just served lunch to about 40 people when Tyler Knox, a veteran wrestling with addiction and his own ghosts, stumbled too close to the propane tank with a lit cigarette. The blast was quick, if not huge. Flames raced through her setup, devouring months of careful work in minutes. The shopping cart, hot plate, and foldable table, her humble altar of service, were reduced to ash and twisted metal before firefighters arrived. The worst loss was the recipe box, a treasury of gratitude. 2 decades worth of notes and napkin scribbles, proof of impact, proof of kindness returned, gone in a breath. As the fire raged, Mikey Shaw, with second-degree burns on his face and arms, kept apologizing, lips cracked and trembling. "I'm sorry, Miss Nora," he repeated as they lifted him into the ambulance. Even with her heart breaking, Nora gripped his burned hand and whispered, "It's all right, honey. Things can be replaced, you can't." Captain Lydia Morales, the investigator, found Nora on a broken slab of concrete, staring at the ruins. "I'm sorry for your loss," Morales said softly, and meant it. She knew the difference between losing possessions and losing purpose. Yet not everything burned. Amid charred metal, one thing survived: a business card. Its edges were singed, but the print remained clear. Vale Holdings, creating solutions for tomorrow's challenges. Cream paper, elegant, carrying weight. On the back, a note: "See her home, monthly payments, keep quiet." Faded but legible. Nora's pulse quickened. The card pointed to something long buried: Dosser Home, Cedar Ridge Group Home, the place where Lee and Manava had vanished 2 decades earlier. Monthly payments could only mean one thing: someone was being paid to stay silent. The card was tied to Marissa Vale's empire, the one built on the misfortune of others. It became Nora's compass. Every morning, she woke determined to rebuild what the fire had destroyed. At night, she lived in the public library, combing through public records, tax filings, and old reports until her eyes burned. Mrs. Yoon Park, the elderly librarian, would bring coffee and gently urge her to rest. "You're looking for something specific," Mrs. Park said one evening as Nora rubbed her eyes. "Justice," Nora answered, the word landing heavy. As she dug deeper, she found a story that made her stomach twist. Vail Holdings' tax returns revealed a framework built on human suffering. A line in the 2012 filings read, "Dining Solutions, $12,000 per month from Cedar Ridge Group Home, year after year." The truth beneath those numbers was uglier than she imagined. Cedar Ridge wasn't just a stopover. It was a place where children worked in kitchens serving other state institutions, and where funds meant for their care were siphoned off. Records showed money intended for children's nutrition routed to Vail Holdings for consulting, which amounted to teaching hungry kids to cook food they weren't allowed to eat. The deeper she went, the worse it became. Cedar Ridge took state money, but the children weren't receiving an education or proper care. They labored in industrial kitchens. They saw a nurse practitioner with a tarnished record, and the funds for their meals flowed elsewhere to Vail Holdings. All roads led to one person, Marissa Vail, now married to the deputy mayor. Marissa had built a vast empire on the misery of vulnerable children. But there was a twist Nora hadn't foreseen. Caleb and Isla hadn't just survived. They flourished. Caleb, using only a smartphone app, founded Nourish, an organization that turned restaurant surplus into free meals for families. By 2020, Nourish had grown into a multi-million-dollar force, outstripping Vail Holdings' ambitions. Isla became a fierce child advocacy attorney, fighting the very system that failed them. She launched Bennett and Associates, a firm devoted to cases no one else would touch, named for a diner worker who once showed her Grace Dot together. Caleb and Isla collected evidence against Marissa and her brother for years. They were patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. When it came, they wouldn't merely topple Vail Holdings. They would dismantle an empire of cruelty. That Christmas Eve, Nora's quiet life was broken by a black Jaguar. It hadn't always been hers. It once belonged to Marissa Vail. Now the car was in Nora's hands, along with the deed to a prized downtown property. It was a small victory, but not why they came. Isla stepped out, her polished composure cracking when she saw Nora. For a breath, she was 9 again, gripping a paper bag, grateful for soup and a stranger's kindness. They brought more than money. They brought justice. The napkin from Nora's kitchen, the one that started everything, was now sealed in plastic, preserved as evidence. When the story finally broke in January 2024, the press named it the Soup Kitchen Scandal. But for those who had been watching, it was a reckoning 20 years in the making. A reminder that sometimes the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, but sometimes it needs a little help. Words are just air until they're backed up by evidence. And the evidence that Isla and Caleb had compiled over 2 decades was devastating in its scope and damning in its detail. Financial records showed money meant for children's meals being diverted to personal accounts. Medical records revealed systematic neglect and abuse. Employment records showed children as young as 8 being used as unpaid labor in commercial kitchens. The recording that Isla played for the packed courtroom was 20 years old, but the digital restoration technology that Caleb's company had developed made every word as clear as if it had been spoken yesterday. Marissa's voice, younger but just as cold, outlined her plan to use the group home children as free labor while collecting full payment for their care. "Those kids are worth more working than eating," Marissa's recorded voice said with clinical detachment. "Let them think that Soup Kitchen woman stole their money, keeps them grateful and keeps them quiet. And if any of them get too mouthy, well, we could always arrange for them to disappear into the system somewhere else. Who's going to miss a couple of throwaway kids?" The community revolt that followed was something to see. An uprising of conscience that reminded everyone why democracy sometimes works despite itself. Homeless families stormed the city council chambers, carrying signs with Nora's picture and testimonials about meals she'd served under that bridge. Former group home residents, now adults with families of their own, came forward with stories that made hardened reporters weep. She fed us, they chanted, their voices echoing off the marble walls of power, bouncing back at the politicians who'd enabled Marissa's system of abuse through their willful blindness and corrupt complicity. She fed us when nobody else would. She saw us when nobody else cared. The mayor, faced with overwhelming evidence of his administration's complicity in 20 years of systematic child abuse, called an emergency press conference where he announced his immediate resignation. The deputy mayor, Marissa's husband, was arrested before he could follow suit. The city council voted unanimously to void every contract Vail Holdings had ever received, and the state attorney general announced a criminal investigation that would eventually reach into dozens of similar facilities across the region. But Caleb's testimony was the bomb that leveled Marissa's empire entirely. The killing blow was delivered with the precision of someone who'd been planning it for 20 years. His forensic accounting, backed up by teams of investigators and data analysts, proved that Vail Holdings had embezzled $2.8 million from school lunch programs over the past decade. Money meant to feed children was redirected to Marissa's personal accounts, vacation homes, and luxury cars. The numbers were staggering, but it was the human cost that truly broke hearts in that courtroom. Caleb spoke in a voice that remained steady despite the tears streaming down his face, describing how he and his sister had been forced to work 16-hour days in commercial kitchens, preparing thousands of meals for school districts while being fed nothing but thin gruel and stale bread. "We made food for other children while we starved," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of accumulated pain. "We prepared birthday cakes for school celebrations, while we forgot what cake tasted like. We packaged lunches for field trips we would never take to places we would never see for childhoods we would never have." Izila's testimony was equally devastating, but delivered with the clinical precision of someone who'd learned to weaponize her pain in service of justice. She detailed the systematic abuse that went beyond mere hunger, describing how children who complained or asked questions were punished with solitary confinement, how medical care was withheld as a form of control, and how education was replaced with labor that generated profit for Marissa's empire. "They didn't just steal our food," Isla said, her voice cutting through the silence of the packed courtroom like a blade through cloth. "They stole our childhoods, our health, our futures. They turned us into commodities, bought and sold and traded like livestock. And when we dared to dream of something better, when we dared to believe we deserved more than scraps and cruelty, they made sure we knew our place." The climax came on the third day of testimony when Marissa, finally realizing that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her like a house built on sand, lunged across the courtroom at Nora in a final act of desperate rage. She moved like a woman possessed, her face twisted with 20 years of accumulated hatred for the person who'd shown kindness when Marissa had demanded only submission. But Nora, weathered by 20 years of serving soup to desperate people and strengthened by decades of choosing love over fear, caught Marissa's wrist with hands that remained steady despite everything she'd endured. The courtroom held its breath as these two women faced each other across 20 years of pain and injustice. Predator and prey switched roles in a moment that felt like cosmic justice finally asserting itself. "You starved them," Nora said, her voice calm as still water, carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "You took children who had nothing, and you gave them less than nothing. You turned their hunger into your profit, and their pain into your pleasure. I saved you the trouble of having a conscience." The judge, a stone woman who'd seen too many cases of institutional abuse, but never one quite this systematic, sentenced Marissa to 15 years in federal prison and ordered full restitution to every child who had been harmed by her operation. The amount was staggering, over $40 million when accounting for lost wages, medical costs, psychological damage, and punitive damages. But money, as important as it was, couldn't undo 20 years of trauma. What mattered more was the symbolic victory, the knowledge that someone had finally been held accountable for treating children like commodities instead of human beings. What mattered was the message sent to every other Marissa Vail operating in the shadows that their time of reckoning would come. The mayor, faced with his own corruption charges and overwhelming evidence of his administration's complicity, held one final press conference before disappearing into federal protection and a plea deal that would keep him out of prison in exchange for his cooperation. At that conference, with shaking hands and a voice that cracked with something that might have been genuine remorse, he tore up every eviction notice his office had ever served against Nora's various soup kitchens. And Caleb, tears streaming down his face as he watched 20 years of planning finally come to fruition, handed Nora a key. Not to the Jaguar, though that was part of the package. Not to money, though there was plenty of that too. The key was to something far more valuable. Something that represented the completion of a circle that had begun with a bowl of soup on a snowy December morning. The new Soul Stew opened 6 months later in the heart of downtown. A gleaming facility that looked like a restaurant but operated like a mission. The building had been Marissa's headquarters, the place where she'd planned her empire of exploitation. But now it hummed with the sound of industrial mixers preparing soup for anyone who needed it. The kitchen was state-of-the-art, capable of serving 500 meals a day, but it was designed with dignity in mind. The dining room looked like a real restaurant with tablecloths, flowers, and music playing softly in the background. There were no lines, no numbers, no degrading processes designed to make people feel ashamed of their hunger. There were just tables and chairs and servers who understood that food is love made visible. The gold plaque by the door read simply, "No one leaves hungry." But underneath, in smaller letters that most people missed unless they were looking for it, were the words that really mattered. In memory of every child who went to bed hungry and in hope that no child ever will again. Even Marissa, working off her community service in the kitchen while serving the first year of her sentence under a work release program, learned something about the dignity of honest labor and the satisfaction of feeding others instead of feeding off them. She worked in silence, mostly, her designer clothes replaced by a simple apron, her manicured nails broken from honest work. At first, she did the work with resentful compliance, going through the motions without understanding the mission. But gradually, something began to change. Maybe it was seeing the gratitude in people's eyes when they received a meal. Maybe it was finally understanding what it meant to give instead of take. Or maybe it was simply the weight of 20 years of accumulated guilt finally finding a constructive outlet. One evening, as they were closing up the kitchen, Marissa approached Nora with something that might have been an apology, struggling to escape from lips that had never learned how to form such words. "I don't know how to say sorry for 20 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nora looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had caused so much pain, who had turned cruelty into a business model and suffering into profit. Then, she handed Marissa a ladle and said simply, "Start with tomorrow's soup." Layla adopted a little girl from Cedar Ridge Group Home during the facility's closure. A child with hollow eyes and 2 thin arms who reminded everyone of 2 orphans who'd walked into a diner 20 years before. The girl had been in the system for 3 years, passed from home to home, failed by every institution meant to protect her. "Her name's Nora," Layla announced at the grand opening celebration, the little girl clinging to her hand like a lifeline, while taking in the warmth and abundance of the new Soul Stew with eyes that couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. And she's going to grow up knowing that the world has people in it who will feed her when she's hungry and hold her when she's scared. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was the cycle completing itself. Trauma transformed into healing. Pain converted into purpose. The little girl would grow up in a world where Marissa Vale's empire of exploitation had been replaced by Nora Bennett's legacy of compassion, where the very building that had once housed meetings about maximizing profit from human misery now served free meals to anyone who needed them. Walter Price, now 94, and still sharp as the day is long despite his bent back and slow shuffle, came to the grand opening ceremony, leaning heavily on a walker but refusing all offers to sit down. He'd outlived Mickey's Diner, outlived the 3 owners, and outlived his own expectations of how long a dishwasher could keep going on stubbornness and spite. He shuffled up to Nora during the ceremony. His eyes were still bright despite the clouded cataracts, and he delivered his verdict on 20 years of struggle and redemption. "Kid," he said, his voice still rough as sandpaper dragged across concrete, "you fed the wolves, and they remembered. Funny how that works when you give instead of take." But perhaps the most beautiful moment came on a snowy December evening. Exactly 20 years after that first bowl of soup, that had started this whole chain of events. Nora was closing up the kitchen when she heard humming from the dining room. A sound so pure and sweet, it seemed to make the very air shimmer with joy. There sat Layla, now a successful mother, humming, "You Are My Sunshine," while her daughter colored at one of the tables. The little girl was using bright yellow crayons to draw what looked like a bowl of soup with steam rising from it in spirals that turned into musical notes. "My grandmother used to sing that to me at the first orphanage," Layla said when she saw Nora watching from the kitchen doorway. "Before the hunger got so bad, we forgot how to sing. Before we learned that music was a luxury we couldn't afford, you gave that back to us. You know, the ability to remember joy, the permission to hope for better things." Nora's eyes filled with tears. She'd been holding back for 2 decades, salt water that tasted like vindication, sorrow, and gratitude all mixed together. All those years of doubt, all those nights wondering if she'd done the right thing. If one bowl of soup could really matter in a world so full of cruelty and indifference, here was her answer, humming softly in the warm light of a kitchen filled with hope instead of hunger. The old recipe box was gone, burned in that fire all those years ago. But Nora had learned that the most important recipes aren't written down anyway. They're passed from heart to heart, from one hungry soul to another, in the simple act of seeing someone's need and choosing to fill it. They're measured not in cups and teaspoons, but in compassion and courage, seasoned with justice and served with the understanding that we're all just temporary stewards of whatever abundance we're blessed to receive. Feed one mouth, you save a body. Feed a soul, you save generations. As I finish this tale, sitting in my chair by the window where I've watched the world change for nearly a century, I can see the soul stew from here. The lights are always on, the door never locked, steam rising from the kitchen like prayers ascending to heaven. The building glows with warmth in the December darkness, a beacon for anyone who needs to remember that kindness still exists in a world that sometimes seems to have forgotten how to care. Sometimes late at night when the snow is falling and the world is quiet, except for the whisper of wind through bare branches, I see a black Jaguar pull up. 2 figures get out. No longer the hollow-eyed children they once were, but successful adults who never forgot where they came from, or who helped them survive their darkest hours. They roll up their sleeves and help serve soup to whoever needs it, their faces reflecting the same kindness that Nora showed them all those years ago. Caleb, now in his late 20s, moves through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who learned early how precious food can be. He's expanded Nourish to serve meals in 12 cities, partnering with formerly homeless individuals to run the local operations, creating jobs for people who understand hunger from the inside out. His company doesn't just deliver food. It delivers dignity, respect, and the revolutionary idea that everyone deserves to eat well, regardless of their ability to pay. ILO works with local lawmakers to reform the child welfare system, using her legal expertise and personal experience to craft legislation that prioritizes children's well-being over institutional convenience. She's helped pass laws requiring more stringent oversight of group homes, better funding for nutrition programs, and harsher penalties for anyone who profits from child abuse. Together, they've created a foundation that bears Nora's name, providing grants to soup kitchens and food pantries across the country. But more than money, they provide something that can't be quantified: hope. Hope that systems can change, that justice can prevail, that kindness planted in darkness can grow into something beautiful and transformative. The Jaguar itself has become something of a legend. The neighborhood Caleb had it repainted from black to sunny yellow, and Isla had the words "free meals" inside, printed on the doors in letters that can't be missed. It's not just transportation anymore. It's a mobile advertisement for the power of redemption. A rolling reminder that even the vehicles of the corrupt can be transformed into tools of healing. And sometimes, if you listen closely, when the wind is just right and the night is very still, you can hear something floating on the air from that kitchen. Not just the clatter of ladles and the bubble of simmering broth, but something else. Something that sounds suspiciously like hope, like healing, like the echo of a 9-year-old girl's voice humming, "You Are My Sunshine," while she colors pictures of soup bowls and dreams of a world where no child goes hungry. The veterans under the Morrison Street Bridge still gather sometimes, though most of them have found housing through programs that Isla helped establish. They come to the soul stew not because they need the meals, but because they remember when Nora served them from a shopping cart with more heart than resources. They come to pay their respects to a woman who understood that dignity matters as much as nutrition. That seeing someone's humanity is just as important as feeding their body. Sergeant Luis Navarro, his prosthetic leg now cutting edge thanks to veterans' benefits, Isla helped him secure, works part-time at Soul Stew as security. Not because the place truly needs guarding, but because he wants to shield the woman who sheltered him when all he had left was hunger and pride. Too stubborn to ask for help. Nadine Porter, the Vietnam-era nurse, runs Soul Stew's clinic, offering basic care to anyone who comes through the doors. She's witnessed too much pain to refuse anyone, and she knows hunger and illness often waltz together in poverty's long dance. Her clinic follows the same rule as Nora's kitchen: no questions, no judgment, just assistance for whoever needs it. The anniversary of their first shared bowl has become the neighborhood's unofficial holiday. A day the community gathers to remember how a single generous act can echo for decades. The celebration isn't flashy or ornate. It's a common meal where everyone shares one table, where the served become the servers, where former foes break bread in a reconciliation ritual unimaginable 20 years ago. Marissa, 3 years into her sentence and genuinely changed by serving others, wrote a letter Nora keeps framed on her office wall. It isn't eloquent. Marissa was never deft with words unless she wielded them like blades, but it's honest. In a way that slices past legal jargon and courtroom theater to reach something essential about our capacity to change. I spent 20 years building an empire on other people's hunger, the letter reads in her knee hand. I told myself I was helping, giving structure and discipline to kids who needed guidance. But I was really feeding my own hunger for power and control. You showed me the line between taking and giving, between using people and serving them. I can't undo 20 years of harm, but I can try to spend the rest of my life balancing the scales. The letter goes on to outline Marissa's plans after release, her intent to use her business skills to bolster groups like Soul Stew, and her promise to make amends not only with restitution, but through service. She signs simply, Marissa Vale, Marissa Vale, as if she's finally learned to own both halves of herself instead of hiding behind titles and married names. So next time you pass a soup kitchen, or spot someone hungry on the sidewalk, or witness a small kindness that seems minor in the vast scheme, remember Nora Harpo and 2 orphans who learned love can be ladled from a bowl and served with crackers on the side. Listen closely. You might hear your name in the steam, calling you to remember that in a world full of Marissa Vales, we each can choose to be Nora Harper instead, to notice hunger and fill it, to see loneliness and warm it, to find despair and offer it a chair at the table where all are welcome and no one leaves empty. Because that's the truth about soup kitchens. They're not really about the soup. They're about the kitchen, the place where strangers become kin, where the broken are mended one meal at a time, and where ordinary people discover they can change the world one bowl at a time. The torn apron Nora wore during the bridge years now hangs framed in the new Soul Stew kitchen, a reminder that the most important uniform is often the one stained by service. Each morning, as the staff arrives to prep the day's food, they touch that frame for luck, carrying forward the legacy of a woman who proved that the smallest kindnesses can echo for decades, transform lives, and move mountains of indifference, carving valleys of compassion where none existed before. The recipe for that first bowl, the one that set everything in motion, has been recreated and perfected by Soul Stew's head chef, a former Food Network personality who walked away from television to feed people who couldn't pay. It's called Nora's Special, and it uses ingredients you can't measure: a cup of compassion, a tablespoon of hope, a generous portion of human dignity, and love enough to feed anyone who's hungry. Every serving carries that same charge, that same intent, that same refusal to accept that anyone should go hungry in a world of plenty. The steam curling from those bowls brings more than the scent of vegetables and broth. It carries the promise that someone cares, that someone sees you, that someone believes you deserve to eat regardless of circumstance or ability to give back. Soul Stew now has 7 sites across 3 states, each staffed in part by people once served there. People who understand hunger from the inside and refuse to let others endure what they did. The model has spread to other groups, weaving a network of compassion across the country like a web of hope. But it began with one woman who saw two hungry kids and decided rules mattered less than hunger, profit less than people, her comfort less than someone else's urgent need. It began with a choice that seemed small, rippling outward like rings on a pond, touching lives in ways she could never have foreseen. And as I sit here, watching snow fall past my window on another December night, I still see those circles widening. I see Soul Stew's warm lights piercing the dark, promising hot sustenance to anyone who needs it. I see the yellow Jaguar at the curb, its bright color a cheerful refusal of the shadow it once cast. Most of all, I see hope that systems can change, that justice can hold, that individual acts of kindness matter in ways we may never fully grasp. Hope that in a world that sometimes seems designed to crush the vulnerable, there will always be people like Nora Bennett who choose compassion over convenience, service over self-interest, love over fear. The steam still rises from that kitchen every night, carrying with it the prayers of the fed and the hopes of the hungry. And somewhere in that steam, if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you can hear the voice of every soul who was touched by kindness when they needed it most. You can hear them saying thank you. You can hear them saying they remember. You can hear them promising to pass it on. And in a world that too often forgets the power of simple human decency, that promise echoes louder than any symphony, more beautiful than any song. As enduring as the love that first filled a bowl with soup and changed the world one spoonful at a time. Years passed, and Nora's legacy continued to bloom in the quiet corners of the world. Soul Stew wasn't just a soup kitchen anymore. It had become a movement, a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of one person's kindness to change the world. Caleb and Nora, once the hungry children who had been fed by a stranger, had become the architects of a new world. Through Nourish and their legal advocacy, they transformed the lives of countless others, ensuring that no child would ever go to bed hungry again. As the seasons changed, the lights of Soul Stew never dimmed. The staff, many of whom were once recipients of Nora's kindness, now served others with the same warmth and compassion they had received. They knew the value of a simple meal, the power of being seen, and the unspoken bond that connected them all. On the anniversary of that first bowl of soup, Nora stood at the front of the bustling kitchen, her heart full. She had seen it all, the darkness, the struggle, and the triumph. She had come full circle, not just as a woman who fed others, but as a beacon of hope, showing the world that kindness, though often small, could move mountains. And so each night, as the steam rose from the pots of soup, carrying with it the echoes of gratitude, Nora whispered a quiet prayer. May we never forget the power of one bowl, one person, and one act of love. In the warmth of that kitchen, surrounded by the people whose lives she'd touched, Nora knew one truth above all: kindness never fades. It simply grows, multiplying in the hearts of those who choose to pass it on. Snow falls again, slow as sifted flour, and the windows of Soul Stew glow like a hearth at the end of a long road. The yellow Jaguar no longer prowls the curb. It naps beneath the back awning with the delivery vans, its doors still bearing the same promise: free meals inside. Those words hang above the kitchen pass now, carved into a plank of salvaged maple that catches steam, laughter, and some nights, a hum that sounds like hope. Caleb moves through the walk-in with a hand on the crates the way some men touch a friend's shoulder. He takes inventory like prayer: oranges, onions, milk, rice, the gentle broth for fragile teeth, gluten-free crackers for the boy with the red wristband. Nourish has spread to a dozen cities, more if you count the pilot on the reservation. And every warehouse manager knows to call him before feast turns to waste. In the morning, he answers truckers with extra trays of chicken. At midnight, he answers strangers who begin with, "Someone gave me your number." He hires from the line, trains in the kitchen, and insists on doing the first grocery run with every new site, because the first list tells him who they intend to be. Isla keeps a small office near the host stand for nights when courthouse air has gone stale and she needs something honest. She welcomes first-timers in the same steady voice she uses at City Hall, only gentler. No ID, no fee, no clock. Between soup refills she edits policy, turning fences into nets and loopholes into locks. The drafts carry steam stains. Number 1 minds. She writes grants like recipe-specific, nourishing, repeatable, and argues with the calm of someone who can ladle and legislate. It's hard to say whether she saves more lives with commas or cumin, so she keeps using both. Nora Bennett has an office because the board insisted, but the door never closes. On the wall, the bent ladle from the bridge years, and beside it, a shadow box with a creased napkin and a hand-copied recipe card. The card refuses exactness. It says things like, salt until a tired person sits up. And if the broth tastes like loneliness, add garlic and a song. People tap the glass on their way, in the way ballplayers tap a sign. Enough hands have followed Nora's habit that there's a soft oval where proof has lived for 20 winters. I watch now from a window above the tailors. The alley isn't pretty. It's better true. Doors yawn, pallets sigh. The produce man who swore he'd retire shows up anyway to argue about lettuce and stay for chess. Kids on scooters fetch herbs from the Haleporter garden where the bridge once cast a cold shadow. Veterans water the beds. A mosaic sets broken plates and sky-colored tiles into a path. A cartwheel, a blue flame, a spoon. People read it with their feet. The winter the big storm came, lines snapped and traffic folded. Soul stew ran on generator and stubbornness. Volunteers arrived on skis and sleds. Sergeant Luis Navarro, security by title, sentinel by temperament, moved everywhere at once. A pickup slid into the curb. A teenager climbed out with blood on his lip and apology in his mouth. Luis steadied him. Nathan Porter met them in the clinic with a headlamp and mercy. Soup first, she said. Then we'll call your mother. And I'll tell her you were brave. He laughed and cried at the same time. It happens more than you'd think. Up front sits a hard-bound ledger that started as a volunteer schedule and became something else. People still write hours and numbers, but they also leave promises. I'll come back to wash dishes. I'll brain my neighbor. I will try to speak gently. Some entries are careful, some rushed, some signed with initials that look like confession. Once a month, in tidy block letters, there's unveil on the slowest shift suds and rinse until the heat blushes. The knuckles. No plaque, no speeches, just water, soak time. In another town, inside another set of walls, Marissa runs a culinary training with plastic knives and real patience. Her letters have grown quieter and heavier. She doesn't ask to be forgiven. She asks to be useful. Some nights that is the same thing. Each year on the anniversary of the first bowl, the block closes without barricades because nobody drives through tradition. A long table appears with plain sheet cake and the bent ladle in the middle like a relic. Folks bring bells sleek, tinny, too early sleigh bells. Someone reads names. Someone reads a poem that never rhymes and always lands. Then the bells ring like rain beginning on a roof. The ladle taps the rail, proof, proof, proof. It is foolish and holy, both. Little Nora isn't little now, but she still hums when she thinks. Some nights she sits at the crescent-knit window. Table and draws maps of kitchens, sinks like lakes. The fryer a volcano labeled do not touch without an adult. The past stretched into a river where bowls float downstream. Her school essay, evidence, read like a recipe and a closing argument at once. Isla taped it to the cabinet and grinned wide enough to hang a coat. On weekends the head chef, once a TV name, now happy to be paid in thank yous, teaches her to sharpen a knife by ear. She teaches him the difference between cumin and grief. The napkin has gone on loan twice, to a museum show about kitchens that saved cities and to a stayhouse hearing on reform. It traveled like a fragile heart and came home in Isla's hands. Back on the wall, Nora pressed her palm to the glass as if she could flatten the past and make it behave. She can't, none of us can. The napkin is less a receipt now than a hinge, the small thing a door swings on. City Hall sounds different. Not quieter government never learned quiet, but less pleased with its own echo. The oversight office visits the homes it licenses. Food budgets reach mouths, not vacations. Penalties have teeth, nuts have stitches. A councilwoman who once winced at justice now says we owe like grace. It isn't tidy. It is better than tidy. It works the way soup works: shared, hot, hard to hoard. The Jaguar's second act is delivery legend. After the repaid, neighbors flagged it down like a bus. When it idles by the courthouse, jurors take oranges and rethink what evidence means. When it hums beside the shelter, cinnamon and clove roll down the alley, and men on the stoop sit up like the broth called their names. Once a rumor spread through town that the money had run out and Soul Stew would close. Fear lined the block. Before the doors opened, Nora stepped onto the stoop, apron tight as always, and lifted her palms like a conductor asking the storm to wait. "We are not closing," she said, and the quiet felt like a warm blanket. "Not today, not tomorrow. If a world arrives where nobody is hungry, we'll be here to serve cake." Laughter cracked the rumor's shell. That night the ledger gained 40 new recurring donations and a penciled note. Cake fund. Some afternoons Walter Price shuffles in with a verdict. "You're holding the ladle right," he tells a nervous volunteer. "Soup shouldn't apologize for itself." Sergeant Navarro loses chess on purpose to a boy who needs the win more. Nadine runs a vaccination clinic that dispenses stickers. And calm. Torres brings his grandson and points to the framed apron like a pilgrim. There's a scholarship now, the Napkin Grant, for youth aging out of care who want nursing, culinary, or the honest math of municipal accounting. Grades and references are welcome, but a recipe is required: written, drawn, recorded, or hummed. The only condition: return for a season and teach what you learn to a room that smells like bread. On the 20th anniversary of the reckoning, the street filled with faces old and new. People said their names and one sentence that mattered: "You helped me when the lights went out. You fed my son when the card was empty. You looked at me like I was someone, and then I was." Afterward, bowls lifted like lanterns and steam rose in thin columns that caught the streetlight. "I don't know what anyone else calls holy. That will do for me." Nora's hair has gone from silver to snow. Her hands shake sometimes when the rush hits, but steady is something you can be in pieces. I asked if she ever wished the first bowl had gone differently. She smiled like someone who knows what regrets eat when left alone. "Regret is a hungry animal," she said. "I keep it fed with work." Then she added time until the room remembered to breathe. Some nights, when the dining room is quiet and the exit signs are the only lights still practicing, little Nora hums, "You Are My Sunshine," while she sets the last forks. She thinks she's alone with a line of steam and her own heartbeat. From the alley, "Stare, I hear the stitch." Her voice pulls yesterday to tomorrow, hunger to plenty, grief to the kind of joy that knows what it costs. People come. People eat. People leave lighter than they arrived. The work goes on hand to hand, bowl to bowl, like a recipe whispered from one kitchen to the next. A cup of compassion, a tablespoon of courage, a generous measure of dignity, salt enough to tell the truth, heat enough to change what it touches. The sign above the pass promises that no one leaves hungry. The ledger near the door shows how ordinary hands keep promises. And the steam carries names. If you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you can hear them. The fed saying thank you, the hungry saying hold on, and the rest of us promising to pass it on until the last bowl is lifted and the last debt is paid.